Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings. We'll be looking at Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly. We have already had one lecture on this story. We'll just continue with the text today. But as I may have mentioned already in the first lecture, this is a story about after the First World War. So it's important to have that background in mind. This is a story written in the aftermath of the war. So the emotions, the embodiments, the identities, and the setting of the story is essentially a post-war setting, a post-war one. And we have seen already how at the beginning of the story we have two contrasting models of masculinity pitted against each other. So we have old Woodifield, who is essentially a senile person whose descriptions, the way he's described, is, it would suggest that he has been essentially infantilized with time, infantilized by the members of his family. And in contrast to that, we have the boss, whose name we'd never know. He's just got a boss in the story, and the suggestion that that is given in the story by the writer is that the boss is very much, despite being 5 years older than Woodifield, the boss is very much in control of his life. He's stout, rosy, still at the helm, so he's at the helm of things, he's in control of things, and that's something which is indicated over and over again in the story. And we have seen how that the office of the boss becomes an extended embodiment of his masculinity, in the sense that he has acquired new furniture, he has acquired new bookcase, new electric heating, new carpet, and he sits there in a very imperious fashion reading the Financial Times, which is essentially a business newspaper. And the little objects in his office become very important symbolically in terms of communicating the masculinity of the boss, in terms of communicating the gendered location, the gendered privilege that a boss appears to enjoy in the story. So he's reading the business news in the Financial Times, he's flipping it open, the newspaper, with his paper knife. He has all these new amenities, new gadgets with which he's surrounded. But the point in which we stopped in the last lecture is where there's an indication of an object which doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the objects in the story, and that object is a photograph of a boy. We are told that the photograph is almost 6 years old. It's over 6 years old actually, and it's about a boy, a young man, in a grave-looking uniform, so the uniform of a soldier presumably. The photograph is taken in a spectral photographer's park, and the word spectral is important because it has, obviously it means shadowy, but there is a sense of death about spectrality, about something spectral. It's a shadowy quality of death. And that death quality, the death-like quality, is something which creeps into the story and which becomes a bit of an incompatible entity, along with all the architecture of newness that a boss has surrounded himself with. So that we stopped at this point, and in the last lecture, and we observed how this little object, which is just mentioned in passing, almost in passing, and it's an object that the boss doesn't really show off, the boss doesn't draw attention of Woodifield to, is perhaps an important object. It's perhaps suggestive of something. Maybe the boss is trying to conceal something with that object. Maybe it has a history, maybe it has a past, and that will be unfolded as we move on in the story. Now, coming back to Woodifield, we see how the entire gendered identity is almost reversed in the story, because Woodifield is allowed to come to the city by his wife and daughters. And of course, when you allow someone something, the obvious assumption is you have the agency to permit that person to do something. And a person who is being allowed, it doesn't quite have the agency. So he or she would require your permission, would require approval from you in terms of being allowed to do something. And it's also described that how he is brushed, how he's dressed up by his wife and daughters in a very infantilized way. So he's essentially like an old man who's also a baby. And that is interesting, because what that tells us essentially is that he's not really a masculine person. So his masculinity, his vigor as a manly person is being questioned, is compromised. So he has what we call a crisis in embodiment, right? So he doesn't quite have the agency, he doesn't quite have the mobility of the other people around him. And it would appear in the story that the women in the story appear to have more mobility than the men, and the men over here are obviously very old men, as we will see. So in a very interesting sense, the stereotypical assumptions about gender and mobility and agency are interestingly problematized in this story. Okay, so we saw how in the last section there's an indication, there should be on the screen, that the photograph of the boy in uniform, it was not new. It had been there for over 6 years. So, so it's incompatible essentially with the new objects around the boss. He's sort of planted in the middle of all this new architecture, this new furniture, and the new amenities in his office. But at the same time, there is this old photograph of a boy in a very grave-looking uniform. And again, grave-looking has connotations of death as well. Okay, so, and then we have Woodifield telling the boss, there was something I wanted to tell you, said old Woodifield, and his eyes grew dim, remembering. Now, what was it? I had it in my mind when I started out this morning. His hands began to tremble, and patches of red showed above his bed. So, obviously Woodifield is described as a very pathetic figure. He's someone that we are supposed to pity, essentially. So, he's struggling to remember something, patches of red showing on his bed, which means it's a strain for him to remember something. So he's reached that level, he's reached that degree of senility, he's reached that degree of decadence, where the very act of remembering becomes a strenuous act for him. That's something that he's struggling to say. He's struggling to remember something he had set out in the morning to tell the boss. So patches of his hands began to tremble, and patches of red showed above his bed. So signs of senility quite clearly. Poor old chap. He's on his last pins, thought the boss, and feeling kindly, he winked at the old man and said jokingly. So again, look at the condescending quality of the boss. It's being very patronizing, and he feels very superior compared to Woodifield. So and we saw already before that how sitting there in front of Woodifield gave him a sense of solid satisfaction, and that satisfaction comes out of a knowledge of superiority, that you feel superior compared to Woodifield, you feel superior compared to the person opposite you, who is quite evidently inferior in terms of health, in terms of social standing, in terms of agency, in terms of mobility. So he's a senile old man who is allowed by his wife and daughters to come to the city on Tuesdays. He's dressed up by his wife and daughters, he's brushed up by his wife and daughters. So he's essentially an immobile person. He's not quite someone who has a lot of mobility or agency, and compared to which the boss obviously appears to enjoy a lot of privilege, appears to enjoy a lot of agency. So he has a luxury to be patronizing, he has a luxury to be kind, he has a luxury to be generous to Woodifield, because that would consolidate his knowledge, his sense of superiority. So this is what he thinks. Poor old chap, he's on his last pins, he's on his last legs of life, thought the boss. And feeling kindly, he winked at the old man and said jokingly, I'll tell you what, I've got a little drop of something here that'll do you good before you go out in the cold again. It's beautiful stuff. It wouldn't hurt a child. He took a key off his watch chain, unlocked a cupboard below his desk, and drew forth a dark, square bottle. That's the medicine, said he, and the man from whom I got it told me in strict QT it came from the cellars at Windsor Castle. Old Woodifield's mouth fell open at the sight. He couldn't have looked more surprised if the boss had produced a rabbit. Now, this little section is interesting because the boss over here, he feels kindly towards Woodifield, and that kindness comes from a sense of superiority, it comes from a sense of the position of privilege, from which Woodifield looks very inferior, looks quite pathetic in quality. And so the boss says, I'll give you something which will help you, poor old chap, and he brings out a bottle of whiskey, and this is obviously, again, it becomes the metaphor of masculinity. It's a very male drink, traditionally, stereotypically. And then he goes on to show it off. He goes on to tell people that, tell Woodifield that this is a very special whiskey. The person he got it from told him in strict confidence that it came from Windsor Castle, which is obviously a marker of privilege, a marker of royalty, a marker of aristocracy, essentially. So that makes the drink even more, priceless in quality, even more valuable in quality. That becomes, again, an extension of the boss's masculinity, an extension of the boss's masculine privilege. And if you look at Woodifield's reaction to it, old Woodifield's mouth fell open at the sight. He couldn't have looked more surprised if the boss had produced a rabbit. Now, this is interesting because the whole act of pulling out a rabbit out of a hat is a very traditional magician's trick, right? So to Woodifield sitting across the table from the boss, that side of the bottle of whiskey being brought out of a cupboard is tantamount to magic. It's tantamount to something that he rarely sees. So, how do you define magic? We define magic as something which is almost unnatural. It doesn't appear naturally. It doesn't happen naturally. So to Woodifield, this act of the boss to bring out a bottle of whiskey is almost an act of magic. So he couldn't have looked more surprised if the boss had produced a rabbit. It's whiskey, aren't it? He piped feebly. The boss turned the bottle and lovingly showed him the label. Whiskey it was. So again, he's almost, he's completely blown away. He's completely flabbergasted, in a very positive sense. He's amazed at the sight, and it's whiskey, aren't it? He piped feebly. So he's feeble, he's old, he's weak, he's pathetic, he's trembling, and he's going red in the bed, etc. So all these are signs of senility, all these are markers of weakness, femaleness, a feeble quality. So he piped feebly. The boss turned the bottle and lovingly showed him the label. Whiskey it was. "Do you know," said he, peering up at the boss wonderingly, "they wouldn't let me touch it at home." And it looked as though he was going to cry. And again, this is the continuation of the pathetic quality of Woodifield, where he says quite clearly that, back at home, they wouldn't let me touch it. They wouldn't let me touch alcohol. And he says it in a way as if that he's going to cry. He's going to break down in tears. And this obviously is an indication of his masculinity crisis, the fact that he's not really a man in control anymore. He's not really a decision maker anymore. He's not really someone who calls the shots anymore. So all these traditional markers of masculinity, the stereotypical markers of masculinity, he doesn't have, right? So, and the boss's reaction is interesting, and it is obviously suggestive of the kind of person he is, at least at this point of time. So when the boss hears that the people, the girls, the woman in Woodifield's home would not let him touch alcohol, wouldn't let him touch whiskey, this is what he says. "Ah, that's where we know a bit more than our ladies," cried the boss, swooping across for 2 tumblers that stood on the table with a water bottle and pouring a generous finger into each. So again, this is very stereotypically, arrogant masculinity, a masculinity which is, situated in arrogant privilege, or at least the assumption of privilege, the assumption of superiority. And this remark that the ladies want to know about alcohol because we know that it has a medicinal purpose. That's medicine. So it's like a man talk. It's like mansplaining, and it's a complete, very very blunt assumption of superiority, very blunt assumption of privilege that the boss is exhibiting away up. So it's interesting because when we started discussing the story, I introduced the story as a feminist satire, as a critique, as a feminist critique of a certain kind of masculinity. But what we see over here is the boss is allowed to grow, allowed to appear as a masculine, dominant masculine character, as a privileged masculine character. And that growth, that consolidation of privilege, that apparent consolidation of privilege, is important because what will happen later in the story is that privilege will be cut down. That privilege will be essentially castrated, essentially critiqued in a very very strong feminist voice. But at this moment, we hear the boss saying very condescending, patronizing, offensive remarks about women, in the sense that we know more than the ladies. This is whiskey and it's a male drink, so how would the ladies know? It's medicinal purpose. So, and then he pours a generous finger into each, a generous peg into each tumbler that he had brought out. "Drink it down, it'll do you good, and don't put any water with it. It's sacrilege to tamper with stuff like this." He tossed off pulled out his handkerchief, hastily wiped his moustaches, and cocked an eye at old Woodifield, who was rolling in his chaps. So the entire activity, the entire vigor of the boss that the boss exhibits over here in terms of drinking down this little peg of whiskey very very quickly, very briskly, he tossed off and then he pulled out his handkerchief and wiped his moustache, again a marker of masculinity in a very stereotypical way. So he appears at this point as a successful boss, a successful person in his office, drinking whiskey, surrounded by new furniture, surrounded by new amenities, and obviously very very imperious in his language, very imperious in his embodiment as of now. So the Woodifield, in contrast, was still rolling in his chaps, so he was still struggling to drink it down, whereas the boss gulped it down at one go. The old man swallowed, was silent a moment, and then said faintly, "It's nutty." But it warned him. It crept into his chill old brain. He remembered. Now, this is a sort of a turning point in the story, and this is why Woodifield remembers what he set out to tell the boss when he started in the morning. "That was it," he said, heaving himself out of the chair. "I thought you'd like to know. The girls were in Belgium last week having a look at poor Reggie's grave, and I happened to come across your boys. They're quite near each other, it seems." Now, this is the first indication in the story, the first direct indication in the story about the dead sons of the boss. And we get to know at this point that both the boss and Woodifield have lost their sons in the war. And this is an image, this is an information that Woodifield gives them about the girls, so presumably his wife and daughters, who went to Belgium last week having a look at poor Reggie's grave. Reggie presumably is the son of Woodifield, and I happened to come across your boys. So this is interesting because he talks about his own son, Woodifield, as poor Reggie. So there's a degree of detachment from the trauma, as it was. So you can talk about his dead son as poor Reggie. So when you say something, poor something, you pity the person, but at the same time, there's a flippant quality about the pity, there's a superficial quality about the pity. It's not really a deep pity, it's not really a deep emotional connect when you say someone, oh, poor something. So you almost, it's indicated with the fact that you have moved on from that loss, you moved on from the sorrow. So he talks about his own son as poor Reggie, and that's interesting. And then he mentions that they happen to come across your boys, the boss's boy, who was, now we know, has also died in the war, and his grave happens to be in Belgium, right beside, in the same graveyard as where Woodifield's son's grave is. They're quite near each other, it seems. Old Woodifield paused, but the boss made no reply. Only a quiver in his eyelids showed that he heard. Now, again, this is interesting because the boss's response is non-verbal over here. So it's only a quiver in his eyelids, which is indicated with the fact that he's heard. So he's responding to that information with a quiver in his eyelids. The girls were delighted with the way the place is kept, piped the old voice, beautifully looked after. Couldn't be better if they were at home. You have not been across, have you? No, for various reasons the boss had not been across. Now, again, if we look at the description of Woodifield is saying that the girls were delighted with the way the place is kept, it's beautifully preserved, it's beautifully maintained, couldn't be better if they were at home. Now, just as an aside to this, it's interesting for us to know, if we're doing a proper cultural study of this particular story, that after the First World War, the tourism industry really boomed. The tourism industry really shot up in terms of its commerce, in terms of its profits, because what happened was essentially was now classified as trauma tourism. The people would go to different countries to see the dear ones' graves. Like for instance, Woodifield's wife and daughters have gone to Belgium. They flew presumably all the way to Belgium to take a look at their son Reggie's grave. And likewise, there are other people, thousands of people, millions of people actually, who travel to different countries to take a look at the graves of their dear ones who had died in the war. So the war, the First World War, the mourning after the First World War did wonders, or worked wonders for the tourism industry at that point of time, in a very perverse kind of investment. So for various reasons, the boss had not been across. So we know the boss hadn't been across. The boss never went to Belgium to take a look at his son's grave. And then Woodifield goes on to describe the place. There are miles of it, quavered old Woodifield, and it's all as neat as a garden. Flowers growing on all the graves, nice broad paths. It was plain from his voice how much he liked a nice broad path. So he's talking about the spatial beauty of the place. There's lots of gardens. The paths are very broad. The flowers growing on all the graves. And this is a very interesting image, a very interesting symbol. The flowers growing on graves, as an example, may be read as an image of regeneration, the cyclicity of life and death. So we have a grave under which someone is dead, and then on top of the grave we have flowers growing. So as an image of rebirth, as an image of regeneration, a very palpable image of regeneration, visually speaking. And then, of course, he talks about nice, broad paths, how the paths are very broad, they're very nice, very scenic in quality. It was plain from his voice how much he liked a nice, broad path. So, and this is the interesting bit, because the way he describes, the way the vocabulary is operative over here, in terms of the graveyard, it is very much a touristy vocabulary. It's very much a vocabulary of describing something which is beautiful and touristy, in the sense of being scenic, in the sense of being beautifully maintained, in the sense of being well preserved, etc. The pause came again. Then the old man brightened wonderfully. Do you know what the hotel made the girls pay for a pot of jam? He piped. Do you know what the hotel made the girls pay for a pot of jam? He piped. 10 francs. Robbery, I call it. It was a little pot, so Gertrude says, no bigger than a half crown, and she hadn't taken more than a spoonful when they charged her 10 francs. Gertrude brought the pot away with her to teach them a lesson. Quite right, too. It's trading on our feelings. The thing, because we're over there having a look around, we're ready to pay anything. That's what it is. And it turned towards the door. So again, These are very, very touristy metaphors. This is a very touristy vocabulary that Woodifield is using, and he's sort of complaining about the price of jams in Belgium, and he's saying that just because we're there, my wife and daughters were there in the hotel, and the hotel made them pay 10 francs for a pot of jam. It was a tiny pot, according to Woodifield, and then he goes on to say Gertrude, who's presumably his wife, or maybe one of his daughters, brought back the jam pot to teach them a lesson. Just because we paid for it, may as well bring it back. So again, these are very petty touristy details which are dished out, which are described over here. So just because we're over there, and then it goes on to say, quite right, it's trading on our feelings. So this is what I mentioned, what I meant when I mentioned trauma tourism. So this is a journey to look at the poor people's, the dead people's graves, the dear ones' graves. Is traumatic, but at the same time, it's becoming a touristy thing at the moment. So they're over there looking around, buying things, checking into hotels, etc. It's trading on our feelings. They think because they're over there having a look around, we're ready to pay anything. That's what it is. And it turned towards the door. So you say, we're over there taking a look at a son's grave. It's an emotional thing, but then, that doesn't mean they'll rip us off like that, etc. So, that idea of being ripped off, that idea of being cheated, that idea of being overpriced, overcharged for something. And these are very, very petty touristy details which are normal in touristy conversations and exchange of information among tourists. And that is foregrounded over here. That's an important thing. So the entire touristy bit, the entire touristy vocabulary is in the foreground of Woodifield's description, whereas the real emotional connect, the real emotional sense of loss, emotional experience of looking at the son's grave, that never appears in the descriptions. It talks about nice flowers, nice gardens, nice broad parts, the hotels being nice, the hotels being overpriced, etc. It's almost like you're coming back from a little resort, a little vacation, and then talking about it to a friend. So that's the whole idea in this particular description. And it turned towards the door. Quite right, cried the boss. Though what was quite right, he hadn't the least idea. He came around by his desk, followed the shuffling footsteps to the door, and saw the old fellow out. Woodifield was gone. Now, the boss says, quite right. He's crying, he's sort of saying quite right, apparently corroborating Woodifield's description. But then we get to know very quickly that what was quite right, he hadn't the least idea. Now, this is important because so far we have seen the boss is in complete control, complete cognitive control. He's in control of his language. He's in control of what he's consuming in the form of whiskey. He's in control of his surroundings, his control of his extended embodiment, in the sense of reading Financial Times with a paper knife, and in a sense of being planted in a very privileged way in a room full of electric heating, new furniture, new carpet. So he was in complete control of his communication, complete control of his cognition, and complete control of his embodiment. But over here we find that the boss just says quite right in a very echoing, imitative way, without actually realizing, without actually thinking about what he's saying. So that is in complete contrast with the beginning of the story. And this is a point in the story, as I mentioned already, while the turning happens, the entire reversal takes place. And we find that from this point in the story, the boss gets more and more, disempowered, more and more castrated, metaphorically castrated, in a sense that he loses his agency, he loses his sense of privilege, he loses a sense of control over his surroundings. Okay, so Woodifield was gone. For a long time, the boss stayed staring at nothing. So again, looking at nothingness, is completely blanked out over here, in contrast to the way the story had begun, when the boss was in complete control of his surroundings, staring at nothing, while the grey-haired office messenger, watching him, dodged in and out of his cubbyhole like a dog that expects to be taken for a run. Then I'll see nobody for half an hour, Macy, said the boss. Understand? Nobody at all. So again, if you look at the description of the messenger, Macy, he's described as a dog, a dog that is expected to be taken off for a turn. And this is interesting because it's almost like he's not completely human. He's not fully human. He's a very loyal dog. He's a very faithful dog. So his humanity, his identity is marked by his loyalty. It's all determined by his loyalty. So Macy becomes the messenger for the boss, and then the boss says quite clearly, I'll see nobody for half an hour, Macy, and said the boss, understand, nobody at all. Very good, sir. The door shut, the firm, heavy steps recrossed the bright carpet, the fat body plumped down in the spring chair, and leaning forward, the boss covered his face with his hands. He wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. Now, this is a bit in which we'll stop the lecture today, But I'll just unpack this a little bit because what is happening over here, the boss goes back to his office, he shuts his office and instructs, he doesn't want to be disturbed for half an hour. So he goes back, and the fat body, the big, heavy body of the boss, plumped down on a spring chair, and he leans forward on his table, and he covers his face with his hands. And then we have this really important sentence: he wanted, he intended, he'd arranged to weep. Now, this is a point in the story where it begins to get really complex, because he is arranging to weep, he wants to weep, he intends to weep, and is designing to weep. Now, what happens is, what has been suggested is the boss wants to be in complete control of his emotions. He wants to be in complete control of his emotions of loss, of his emotions of mourning. He wants to weep at will. And the ability to weep at will is part of his masculinity. The ability to mourn at will is part of his masculinity. So this is arrogance of the boss, the hubris of the boss in a way. The hubris being false arrogance, dangerous arrogance. But he firmly believes that he can weep at will if he wants to. He can arrange to weep at will if he wants to. So this entire wanting, intending, and arranging to weep become is a very, very important information about the boss's masculinity. And we find from this point of the story how that masculinity, that complex of controlling emotions, begins to be dismantled, begins to get decimated in the story in due course of time. So we stop at this point today, but just going back and rehearsing this lecture, the content we covered in this lecture. So we see how the boss and Woodifield is pit against each other in terms of two different models of masculinity. The boss is being more stout, more rosy, more strong, at least more superficially strong. And then out of that strength, out of that sense of superiority, he gives Woodifield a drink of whiskey, a peg of whiskey to drink. And then on drinking that, Woodifield remembers what he wanted to tell the boss, and then we get to know that the boss's son is dead in the war, had died in the war, and now his grave is in Belgium. He's buried in the same graveyard as Woodifield's son, Reggie. And Woodifield's wife and daughters had been to Belgium recently to take a look at his son's grave, and they happened to come by the boss's son's grave. And then an entire conversation takes place, at least a monologue of Woodifield takes place, about the petty touristy details, about the price of jam, about the hotel, about the nice broad paths, about the gardens, about the flowers. And then we are told that the boss had never been to Belgium. The boss had never visited the actual site of trauma. And then he's visibly disconcerted, is visibly unsettled at that remark by Woodifield. And once he sees Woodifield out, he just says, quite right, quite right. He's saying something blankly without even thinking about it. And then he comes back to his office. He instructs his messenger, Macy, who is compared to a dog, who's described as a dog in terms of absolute loyalty, absolute agency-lessness, absolute faithfulness, etc., but also in a sense of being dehumanized. He tells Macy that I don't want to see anyone for half an hour. He comes back to his office, he shuts his office, and then he sits down on his, he plants his heavy body in the leather armchair, it covers his face and leans on the table, and then we see he wanted, he intended, he'd arranged to weep. So the entire ability, as I mentioned, to weep at will becomes part of his masculinity package. And we find out later in the story as we move on in the next lectures that according to the boss, his loss is so severe, his loss is so special, his loss is so unique that other people might forget the loss, but he will always be able to remember the loss in a way that he'll be able to weep at will. So very interestingly, weeping or mourning, which are stereotypically female or feminized activities over here, are appropriated by the male, by the dominant male, with the difference that he is man enough, he is manly enough to weep at will. He's masculine enough to control his hysteria, to engineer his hysteria, to orchestrate his hysteria. And the ability to orchestrate his hysteria becomes part of the masculinity package of the boss over here. So we stop at this point today, and we continue with the story in the next lectures. Thank you for your attention.